I think we can begin. I'll just give a brief introduction. Is that fine, Eriko?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Eriko Shrestha, who will be leading this insightful session on decarbonization, why, how, and what it means for Nepal. Eriko is a passionate climate professional specializing in clean energy transition with a focus on hard to abate sectors. She's currently pursuing her MSc in Environmental Change and Management at the prestigious University of Oxford. Her work has contributed to significant global sustainability efforts, including revisions to nationally determined contributions for developing countries, research on hydrogen's indirect greenhouse gas impact in the US, and modeling fertilizer production scenarios for India. Additionally, she has analyzed net zero targets for food, beverage, and construction companies in emerging economies. With her deep expertise and commitment to sustainable energy solutions, Eriko is here to share her knowledge and perspectives on decarbonization journey and implications for Nepal. Please join me in welcoming Eriko. Over to you, Eriko.
Thank you for that introduction, Gopal. So I'll jump right into it. Let me share my screen very quickly. Okay, so I assume everyone can see my screen now, but please let me know if that's not true. And the talk today, as you know, is about decarbonization. Why should we decarbonize? How should we decarbonize? And what it means for Nepal. And this talk is booked for about an hour, but I won't be talking all that time. I'm going to leave a lot of room for questions. And feel free to interrupt me at any point with your questions, especially if you don't understand anything. I don't want you to have to sit through the whole talk and ask me a question from the beginning in case it's relevant for the rest of the talk as well. So let me go back. On the title slide, actually, on the top, I have some technologies for decarbonization. So you can see solar, wind turbines, hydropower, geothermal, where we don't have geothermal in Nepal, and there's very little wind in Nepal too. But those are just some foreshadowing of what I'm going to discuss. And at the bottom, some sectors that we need to decarbonize. So buildings, steel, tractors, as well as agriculture, and industry and factories there. So to get more into what I'm going to talk about, here's an outline of what I'm going to say. So I'll introduce myself a bit, although Gopal's already done that for me. I'll share a bit more about why I became interested in the environment, what's my background, in a bit more detail. And then we'll get right into the talk on why should we decarbonize? So what exactly is decarbonization and its relationship with net zero? Followed by how we can decarbonize, so the existing technologies as well as future technologies and policies to decarbonize. And then we'll get into what it means for Nepal, so emissions trends as well as targets that Nepal has set for itself and challenges to decarbonize for the country. So a little bit about me. As Gopal mentioned, I've actually finished my master's in environmental change and management at the University of Oxford. I actually work in the UK, and I'm currently in Nepal, but I will be returning back to the UK to work at a company called Aurora Energy Research, which provides a lot of energy consulting services. Prior to my master's, I worked and lived in the US. I was a research analyst at the Environmental Defense Fund, which is where I was working on hydrogen science and looking into the indirect greenhouse gas impact of hydrogen. And prior to that, I was working at a nonprofit called Climate Analytics, where one of my client countries was actually the government of Nepal. So I supported Nepal in 2020 to revise its pledge to the Paris Agreement, and I did something similar for a number of Caribbean countries while I was at Climate Analytics. And prior to that, I did my undergrad in environmental studies and political science at Swarthmore College. So if you have any questions related to a career in the environment or environmental policy, then I'm also happy to answer those questions at the end of my talk. But basically, the reason that I was first interested in the environment is because I was actually very much interested in human rights and law. And in high school, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And I started looking into what I need to do to get into law school and the fields of law that I could get into. And at that time, I was actually volunteering at a refugee camp and talking to a couple of lawyers who were there and realized that, okay, actually, maybe I should be focusing on the drivers of um, what causes environmental and human harm, and began to actually learn about climate change and decided that, okay, actually, this is a very important issue, and it's like very much worthwhile to have a career in um, preventing or mitigating further environmental harm. And so that's how I started looking into the environment. And I think every kind of degree or job that I've had since then has helped me narrow down what exactly I want to do in the environment. So right now I'm very much focused in the clean energy transition. But initially I was focused on policy as I was working with the government of Nepal, for example. And one of the other reasons I decided that a career in an environment is a good career is because it is a very much growing field, both in terms of technology and innovation, but also in terms of the scale of what's going to be needed. Despite what Trump says, climate change is happening. It's here. It's going to affect us and our future generations. It already affects us in Nepal. Um, and so there are definitely a lot of opportunities, a lot of ways that we can do good in this field, um, and a lot of room for learning because we definitely still don't have the solutions that we need to combat climate change. So with that, if you have any questions related to a career in the environment, happy to take those at the end. But we'll get right into the talk now on what exactly is decarbonization and why should we decarbonize. So when I talk about decarbonization, I'm talking about something actually quite technical, which is bringing the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere to a level where the planet does not get too hot. So we're very much interested in how much carbon is in the atmosphere when it comes to decarbonization, and we want to decarbonize to either remove, reduce, or limit how much carbon is in the atmosphere. So the first way to decarbonize is something I've already talked about, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions produced by the combustion of fossil fuels and limiting future emissions release. So the reason that we are focused on greenhouse gas emissions, so by this I mean carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and there are several um, nitrous dioxide, sorry, and there are several other greenhouse gas emissions. But the reason that we are focused on greenhouse gas emissions is because of the greenhouse gas effect, where these gases essentially trap heat from being released from the atmosphere, which is why the global average temperature of our planet is increasing, because we are receiving infrared radiation from the sun. And these greenhouse gas emissions are kind of like a blanket that's not letting that radiation um, exit the atmosphere. And so our planet is getting hotter. The second way to decarbonize is by capturing emissions and storing it for a long time. And I'll get into both in the next section on how should we decarbonize. But the reason that we must decarbonize, as I've mentioned before, is to achieve net zero. And net zero is also actually quite technical, and it can often be misrepresented or defined poorly, but it's essentially when greenhouse gas emissions released in the atmosphere are balanced by an equal amount of emissions removed. And it was actually quite cool for me to learn about net zero at Oxford because I was able to learn exactly what net zero is from one of the main scientists who came up with the term. I think net zero today is very much confused in the world of carbon accounting and offsets with, okay, as long as we have enough trees, that's net zero. But when we talk about net zero, we're talking about removals that are in addition to what we already have, in addition to the forests in the Amazon, in addition to the forests in Nepal. These are new removals. We can't count past removals from trees, but these will also be new removals using new technology. And in the Paris Agreement, it says that net zero by 2050 entails holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is about 1850s is pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the Paris Agreement says, okay, 2 degrees Celsius is our upper limit. We definitely should not exceed that. But if possible, we should put all our effort into actually limiting the global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there's been a study by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the authority of scientists that the UN agency that facilitates discussions on climate had commissioned. It was a special report on the impacts of a 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer world versus a 2 degrees Celsius warmer world. And the special report had some very daunting consequences of even that half degree Celsius increase and what it means for vulnerable countries like low-lying island states like Maldives, that is already sinking, and even Nepal, which has a very fragile Himalayan ecosystem. And so when we talk about net zero, we are saying net zero by 2050. And that aligns well with kind of putting our very complex system of like biogeochemical cycles at an equilibrium where we can hopefully maintain existing functionalities of the planet and like a decent lifestyle, even at a slightly warmer temperature. But there's been an estimate by scientists that there's a remaining carbon budget for, let's say we get a 50% chance to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is in 2023, in the start of 2023 in January, scientists have estimated that we have about 250 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is about 250 billion tons of CO2 that we can release in the atmosphere and still achieve net zero. But in 2023 alone, we released 36 gigatons or 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And if we continue at that rate, that means that we will reach our budget in 6 years, or that's about 2029. So we need to really drastically reduce the amount of emissions that we are releasing. Are there any questions? I can't actually see anyone the way that I've shared my screen. So if there are questions, please interrupt me. And so because we are releasing emissions at such a large scale, decarbonization to achieve net zero requires changing all aspects of our economy. And so I've listed 8 sectors, so to speak, but this is not a comprehensive list. So we need to decarbonize power generation, so electricity, the way that we produce electricity, no natural gas, no coal. We should need to instead promote solar, renewables, maybe even nuclear, hydropower, geothermal, heat. So at least in Kathmandu, for example, winters are getting warmer, so there's less and less need for heat. But traditionally, we use maybe firewood, or in some households, gas cylinders and gas heaters. But that's also a dirty form of heating a home that would need to change. Land management, so this includes afforestation, deforestation, buildings. So within buildings, for example, there are embedded emissions from the cement that was used for it, the steel that was used to build the buildings. Also insulation related to trapping heat in winter, or improving ventilation in the summer. Transportation, so that's pretty important for Nepal since our power sector is mostly hydropower. But for transportation, we still have many private vehicles increasing on our roads and increasing congestion, air pollution, but also releasing emissions. Agriculture and food, so this also includes changing the types of fertilizers that we use, or being more efficient with the way that we use fertilizers. Food includes also improving our diets in terms of using more plant-based items. Industry includes like cement, steel, manufacturing, like processed foods. industry is actually a hard to abate sector. And by that, what I mean that is it's really difficult to decarbonize industry because it has specific requirements like very high heat or certain types of chemicals or materials that can be very carbon intensive. And generally the production of goods like clothes, I've mentioned food, which also overlaps with industry, but it could also include like production of goods like the laptop that I'm talking through. It's a very complex supply chain, which we need to track and be able to quantify the emissions from production till the end of use of the product's life cycle. Okay, so I've talked about why we must decarbonize, what is decarbonization and its relationship with net zero. Now we're going to talk about how we can decarbonize existing technologies as well as future technologies and policies. So we do have existing technologies to reduce emissions, and we do also use some of them in Nepal. So the most easiest way of reducing emissions is to improve energy efficiency. So efficiency essentially is performing more work with less energy. And so some practical ways where we use efficiency, for example, is vehicle mileage, like traveling more kilometers with 1 liter of petrol on a bike or a car, or a light bulb providing more light with the same amount of watts of energy, or even we've been switching from, for example, I remember the halogen light bulbs to compact fluorescent light bulbs to now LED light bulbs, and they're increasing in efficiency with each new product. But efficiency alone isn't going to help us get to zero, so we need other ways of reducing emissions. Um, the other way is, for example, preventing emissions by switching to zero or low carbon energy sources. So, as I mentioned, wind, solar, hydropower to decarbonize our grid, which is already largely decarbonized. But there is, for example, we import electricity from India, which is largely coal, or during winter when there's not enough water, um, we might be in certain sectors using coal or oil or diesel for electricity. And so we must decarbonize the grid. And in relation to decarbonizing the grid, another effective way of decarbonization is to increase electrification. So um, that means, for example, transportation, moving from combustion engine vehicles like diesel and petrol to electric vehicles, which Nepal is doing a good job of it. But we must electrify more. So using electric heaters over gas heaters. Um, Anything that can be electrified should be electrified. It's kind of like the lowest hanging fruit for us to decarbonize. But we're also going to rely on future technologies to decarbonize. So, for example, capturing emissions is very much a future technology. It's under development. It's not a mature technology. And capturing or removing emissions should only be used for hard to abate cases. So these are cases where it's very difficult to electrify, very difficult to just use renewables and reduce emissions, even though even just electrifying something is very difficult in terms of implementation. And there are several ways of capturing emissions. One is capturing emissions at source. So there's an image here on carbon capture. Oops, sorry, carbon capture. One way is capturing emissions directly at source. So this could be a natural gas plant, and at the top of the chimney there is a carbon capture instrument that can capture the carbon, process it, and transport it either for storage deep into the geology of the earth or to utilize it in a sector like carbonated beverages, where you're using carbon for making Coca-Cola or Pepsi, for example. So that's one way of using carbon capture. Another way is removing it from the atmosphere. So in this case, you're not at a point source, which means you're not at a direct source of an emissions release infrastructure, but you're just using, for example, I've read about these giant fans in Canada capturing emissions from the atmosphere and converting it into salt. It's very much at its infancy. It's not a mature technology, but this is all very experimental. But what's really important for carbon capture is that once the carbon is captured, it is stored or sequestered deep into the geology of Earth. So these are like the rocks, the bedstones of Earth, um, and that they can be stored for 1,000 years. This is what I mean by high integrity storage, is that you can store that carbon for 1,000 years. And the only way to do that is to inject it deep into um, the crust of the Earth. Um, yeah, but there are limitations to carbon capture. So even in labs, I think in the best case scenario, you can only capture 90% of the carbon release. So ideally, in terms of like the hierarchy of decarbonizing and reducing emissions, you want to first not have that emissions be released at all. But if it is released, then use carbon capture and alternative methods. Another way of capturing carbon, or is actually another way that people talk about capturing carbon, is actually offsets, which is a totally different category of reducing emissions. But offsets, in terms of the RED Plus program, for example, that exists in Nepal, means that generally developed countries are paying developing countries to pollute. And by that, what I mean is that developing countries are paid to maintain their forests, to increase forests even, so that a wealthy country, for example, Norway, Singapore, can offset their emissions, or even a company. Companies do this quite often, which is also, I would say, worse than reducing carbon in general. So reducing as much as possible, then resorting to either offsets or capturing carbon is the way to go. There's also another kind of policy that's less discussed in the climate sector that I found, which is demand management. And I think demand management is very important because, as I've mentioned, there's only so far we can go with reducing carbon. And as countries develop, as we have, especially developing countries, an abundance of resources, without really being kind of conscientious and aware of the amount of resources that are being consumed, I think it's really difficult to restrict demand. But I think with more information, with more incentives to reduce consumption, and doing that by managing demand, that's one effective way of reducing emissions in general. So I've listed a couple of examples of how we can limit consumption of fossil fuels and even electricity. So like flying less, for example, taking fewer modes of transport that require like private vehicles, and instead expanding to more public transit is one example. Um, Using less electricity could even mean something simple like switching off lights and electronics when not in use. Limiting consumption of material goods, so you're buying only the amount of clothes that you need and not excess, or using smart meters, which is kind of on the right. I have a meter, not a smart meter, but basically what a smart meter would tell you is predict even the price of electricity and say, okay, electricity is really expensive from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. So don't use your washing machine, um, don't charge your car at that time. Charge it from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. And a smart meter or your smart car can automatically be timed to charge at that time. So kind of changing the sessions when demand is also highest to even it out during the day is very helpful in terms of managing the grid. And then also finding alternatives that are less carbon intensive. So as I've mentioned, using public transit more frequently over private vehicles, but even in terms of our diet, a plant-based diet is much better than a meat and dairy heavy diet. And I'm not saying everyone should go vegetarian or even vegan, but I think it's definitely worth increasing your intake of plant-based foods over meat and dairy. And as an example, I've added this chart, which is greenhouse gas contribution by food type in an average US diet, which is definitely going to be lower in Nepal than in the US, the emissions for our average diets. But as you can see, meat is a significant chunk of emissions that is released from an average US diet, followed by dairy. So any type of animal related product, food, is very emissions intensive. And then comes seafood, eggs, and then comes vegetables. So if we can consume more plants over meat, for example, that's better for the climate. But there are definitely limits to decarbonization, as I've mentioned. There are hard to abate sectors. I've described them as often industrial sectors that cannot easily electrify. For example, steel requires very high heat for its production, which electricity cannot go up there. So, for example, there's a lot of research being done on green steel by using hydrogen and combusting hydrogen to then achieve very high heat to uh, to meld steel. Is that the term? And then we could also be relying on technologies that are still being developed. Like we should not rely on carbon capture, but the rate at which we are releasing emissions means that we will be relying on technologies that are still being developed, and we don't quite know their limits and their potential to their full yet. And I've mentioned sufficiency, for example, as a term. So sufficiency actually means kind of exactly what it sounds like, consuming only until you're sufficient, you're satisfied, and not more. But this can be a bit inappropriate in the developing context because even in a country like Nepal, we have huge inequality. We have massive inequality where pockets of populations, for example, in Kathmandu, have access to far more resources and consume far more than most of the population in rural areas. And so rural areas still need to increase their consumption, which is that they need to increase food consumption because they haven't reached the required calories or recommended calories that they should be consuming. They haven't had access to reliable energy yet, water consumption. So they do need to increase consumption, especially in the developing context. There are already pockets of the population that are over consuming. And so we kind of need to find this balance where people are not over consuming, but the people that need to consume more are also consuming more. And then there's the question of demand reduction and the challenges to implementing it. So as if there aren't already enough challenges to implementation, when it comes to a demand reduction or a demand response, governments are generally very hesitant to implement any type of policy related to demand reduction because it can be perceived as encroaching on private life. And it's really difficult for a government official to run on a platform to say, I'm going to implement policies that are going to reduce your demand if you elect me. And nobody wants a government official to run on a platform that says they're going to restrict my consumption. Like it's an individual right to be able to consume, for example, to be unhinged and like whatever liberties that you can have as a citizen of the country. So demand reduction is very difficult. For example, there's a big backlash to the one-child policy in China, which is essentially a demand reduction policy. But they're very difficult for governments to implement unless they're authoritarian. So now that I've talked about how to decarbonize, I'm going to discuss a bit more on what it means for Nepal. Here's a chart of Nepal's major emission sectors. I really like the source called Our World in Data, which provides a lot of different figures related to the climate and the environment, and it's really worth exploring. So these are greenhouse gas emissions by sector in Nepal. You can see that agriculture, followed by manufacturing, construction, followed by buildings, are the largest three sectors. I wanted to see how it compares to the average of the world. And as we can see, it's very different on the right in the world average. So agriculture, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, let's start with agriculture is actually fourth. In the world average, manufacturing, construction is higher, and buildings is lower. But that's essentially because as countries develop, you begin to consume more electricity and heat. And that's kind of the trend that we see here. And that's the trend that we're going to see in Nepal is that as we develop, there's going to be a higher demand for electricity in order to be able to even light our lights in our buildings, to now be able to power our cars, to be able to use electricity for even communicating right now on this class, for example. So this makeup is going to change over time. And I want to compare this with other countries. Also, I also took this graph from Our World in Data. But this is the per capita greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and industry without accounting for land use change, so without accounting for deforestation or increase in forest cover. And as you can see, Nepal is quite low on this list. On average, a Nepali person releases about 0.4 tons of CO2 per year. Mm. And this is even as we've been increasing our emissions between 2012 and 2017. So we are a very vulnerable country despite not having emitted a lot of emissions historically. You can see that India releases more emissions, so it's 1.8 tons of CO2 equivalent, and USA is the culprit with the highest emissions per capita at 15.7 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. But you can also see that in terms of these developed countries, United States and Canada, their emissions have gradually been decreasing, whereas China, for example, is increasing in terms of per capita emissions. European Union is also decreasing. South Africa is South Africa seems a bit stable. It increased a bit between 2005 and 2014, but now it's been decreasing. But the world average is increasing, and so is the per capita emissions of Nepal. So it's important for us to be aware of this, and as we're developing, we are going to emit more emissions, but be mindful that we are still going to be affected by climate change, and it doesn't discriminate between who has released more historical emissions versus a country like Nepal, which has very low historical emissions. And these are charts that I took from the International Energy Agency, also a very good source for data and visuals. These are charts on carbon dioxide emissions by fuel. So as you can see in Nepal, we use a lot of oil and coal, not very much natural gas, but essentially most of that oil is used for transportation. So transportation is a major sector that we must decarbonize. And coal is essentially used in industries for high heat. In pockets, these are like generally individual assets not connected to the grid. So industry and transportation definitely require decarbonization as in the future in Nepal. So this slide is very text heavy, but I essentially wanted to discuss Nepal's nationally determined contributions, which are pledges that countries that have signed on to the Paris Agreement have set for themselves. While I was working at Climate Analytics, I helped set some of the targets for the second NDC in 2020. But to give you some background on NDCs, as we call it, so the first set of NDCs were submitted in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. And countries are required to revise their NDCs every 5 years. So the second cycle was in 2020, and now in 2025 we have the third cycle. So there will be updates to these targets from every government that is a party to the Paris Agreement. So in the first NDC, there were targets for 2020 and 2030. These are some of the quantifiable targets that I have added to the slide. So some of the targets include increasing the share of electric vehicles, expanding renewables. There was a program called Nepal Renewable Energy Program that was really focused on expanding renewables in Nepal. So for example, here's increasing hydroelectricity to 4 gigawatts by 2020, and then really increasing that to 12 gigawatts of hydroelectricity by 2030. So within 10 years, adding on 8 more gigawatts, which is a lot of electricity. 1 gigawatt is a lot of electricity. And Nepal's done very well in terms of adding forest cover. So as you can see, there was a target to maintain 40% of total land area under forest cover in the first NDC. And because Nepal had achieved 42% while we were revising the second NDC, the country then increased the target to 45% of total land area. There's also more goals related to EV sales in the second NDC, more ambitious goals. So um, increasing EV sales to 90% of all passenger vehicles is very ambitious by 2030. There's also a very ambitious goal of developing 200 kilometers of rail network, which we are very far behind on, and also target some other sectors for decarbonization, like cook stoves, making electric cook stoves the primary mode of cooking in a quarter of all households of Nepal. So these are some of the priorities that Nepal is looking into. One is increasing renewables and by renewables, what they generally mean is solar, increasing forest cover, considering improvement of road infrastructure, which is very difficult in urban areas like Kathmandu, and increasing cook stoves, so related to cooking and buildings. These are some of the focuses of the government. And the government's also submitted a long-term strategy to the Paris Agreement. So this was voluntary for governments to submit a long-term strategy looking up to 2050, where Nepal has set a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045 and net zero by 2050. So actually, this is quite ambitious of Nepal because as a developing country, we could have had a target that takes more time to achieve net zero. For example, India has a target of achieving net zero by 2070, but Nepal has become more ambitious than India in terms of achieving net zero sooner. I mean, one motivation is that governments or agencies would be more likely to provide funding to more ambitious countries. So perhaps that's one motivation. But in general, Nepal is quite ambitious with climate ambition. But as a highly vulnerable country, and with very low emissions, as we saw in previous charts, Nepal has to adapt to climate change, as well as mitigate emissions. And this includes promoting resilience by diversifying power generation, so increasing more solar, strengthening food, freshwater, and forest systems, and improving connectivity, particularly through roads, so that we can provide basic services throughout the country, even in remote areas. But there are challenges to decarbonization as well in Nepal. So one example is related to connectivity, building out, for example, transmission lines in remote terrains, which is why often we resort to off-grid solar, which can also be difficult, or even micro hydropower stations, which can be very difficult still, especially with the variability in climate that Nepal is beginning to experience with climate change. As a developing and poor country, there are also many competing interests in Nepal. For example, should Nepal promote energy security, whether that means continuing to buy electricity that's very coal intensive from India versus expanding renewable energy. There are also setbacks to increasing renewable energy. For example, solar is only available when there are hours of daylight, and then you need to find a way to store that energy in the evening or have another reserve. So there are definitely many challenges to improving and increasing renewable energy in the grid. Another competing interest is, for example, we have a tax system that really incentivizes consumers to adopt private electric vehicles. But that could also be a disincentive, for example, for people to use mass transit systems and to invest in mass transit systems. Essentially, that tax should be going into that tax money collected from cars, from the registration of cars, should be going into improving our mass transit system. But there's still a long way to go. Another challenge to decarbonizing in Nepal, and in general anywhere, could be adoption of technology. For example, we're used to cooking on a certain type of stove. Adopting an induction stove or an electric stove also requires that anybody cooking adjust their style of cooking. We also need skills training, for example, for installing solar panels. And then the really big challenge is financing capital intensive projects. So Nepal is very heavily reliant on foreign aid, and we rely on grants. Oftentimes, these grants don't extend for the long time horizon that's required for a capital intensive project that can last like 25 years versus a grant might be one-off or 5 years or 10 years. But these projects require investment over a very long time. And so meeting all of Nepal's NDC targets from 2020 itself will cost about 3.4 billion US dollars, which actually Nepal has allocated a decent amount of money to achieving the NDC's targets. But implementation is very much an issue in for the government and in the country. And with that, that's the end of my talk. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Hello,
Hello.
um, I'm Saksham. So I have a few questions in mind. First off, since you are in the field, this is something that has been in my mind for a long time. I have noticed that the Ministry of Forestry and Environment in Nepal is largely funded by the Japanese government. What's the reason for it?
I'm not sure exactly what the reason that JICA, I assume, is funding the Ministry of Forest and Environment largely. I think it's probably related to Japan's own foreign assistance targets, um, and that they might be promoting, for example, offsets. So that's very much related to increasing our forest cover in the country and promoting renewable energy. Um, but I'm not quite sure why the Japanese government mostly funds or largely funds the Ministry of Forest and Environment.
Yeah, it seems quite suspicious if you ask me, because the Japanese government doesn't take much interest in other ministries, but it has
Mhm.
largely funded the Ministry of Forestry and Environment.
Hmm. I actually have never looked into it, but that's very interesting, and I'll look into it. Thank you.
Sure. And the next question is, we talked about, well, the aspects of our economy that we need to work on if we want to achieve net zero. So
Mhm.
since we are a developing country, and achieving and maintaining infrastructures that will generate clean energy is very expensive, and since other developed countries have already fully used non-renewable energies to develop, so how do you think economic growth and net zero goes hand in hand? Does it?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of that question again?
I'll repeat the last, I'll make it short.
Okay.
So how do you think net zero and economic growth goes hand in hand? Like, is it
Mhm.
feasible?
I think in the case of Nepal, uh, economic growth and net zero can go hand in hand. I think because the we have the solutions that we need.
Mhm.
We struggle with implementation, but we can leapfrog technology now. We can go from a biomass cook stove to an electric cook stove if there's an off-grid solar facility for a village, for example. So there are those opportunities for economic development. What's also important in Nepal is vocational skills, which there aren't many places where vocational skills are taught. But for example, installing solar panels is a vocational skill that should be, promoted by the government, and by the National Electricity Authority. And I think they did actually quite a bit. Um, but there is still a lot of room for teaching these new kind of green job skills. Theory bio. Um, the other place for economic development is, I think, something that Nepal's already doing, which is setting very ambitious targets for foreign assistance, right? Um,
तर
which
अलिक धेरै एम्बिसियस भएन र?
धेरै ambitious त भयो अब हामीले 200 किलोमिटरको रेल नेटवर्क बनाउन लाग्छ अरे. I don't know when that's going to happen. Um, I mean, I think that's kind of like where countries, I think it's very, there is some strategy to it, and there is also not very much strategy to it in a way, because if a country like Nepal, which is developing poor, is setting very ambitious ambitious goals, then even if Nepal doesn't achieve it, there is a way of raising the agenda for developed countries to say, okay, this developing country is already setting targets like this, and they're going to make way for it. So that gives developing countries a bit more negotiating space to say, we're setting these targets, we're raising the bar, so you should do so as well. So it's not necessarily true that we're going to achieve all these targets that we've set, but there are also other reasons for setting those targets. I mean, some of it is definitely that when setting these targets, the consequences or even the resources needed for these targets were not well understood. But there are also other, I think, political motivations that are considered. And
Thank
to answer your question about economic development and net zero, I think there's definitely room for it to go hand in hand. So it's there is a way to create new jobs if we're looking at like solar, for example, and but there needs to be a lot of reskilling, which is not really implemented right now.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I am an agriculture student, so I would like to learn more about decarbonization in agriculture. I just saw that agriculture contributes in Nepal the highest share to the emissions. So, except decarbonizing like the sources of powers like diesel tractors that are used in agriculture, where else can we apply decarbonization? You told an example of fertilizers. So I would like to learn more about the application.
Yeah, like one common type of fertilizer we use is like urea. I mean, it's very similar to India where we use synthetic fertilizers. So these are chemical fertilizers, which in the production process, requires carbon. It can be carbon intensive, and then when it breaks down and reacts with the soil, it releases emissions. So we can be better at targeting crops with fertilizers versus kind of just like spraying them or spreading them on a farm. The other is manure management. So manure management is also a major source of emissions. When it breaks down, it can release methane. I mean, the other one is kind of livestock. I mean, those emissions are not going to go down, but we can change the livestock feed so that they reduce emissions from digestion. Yeah. Any burning, that's another source, sorry. Burning rice fields. So that also is a source of emissions. So kind of changing the way that we've been farming a bit. I'm not a major, like I haven't really worked in agriculture, but from what I've read, those are some major sources of uh, emissions from our agricultural practices.
Also, I have read somewhere that cooking is also included in agriculture emissions. Is that really the case?
Cooking should not be included in agricultural emissions unless I think it's maybe related to the food sector in general, where maybe cooking is required for the end product, but cooking should not really be included in agriculture. I think sometimes the way that different institutes, agencies account for emissions can differ. That has changed because there have been clear guidelines submitted by uh, the SBTI, which stands for the science, I'm totally blanking right now, but there are guidelines on how to account for food sector emissions, for example, released by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but that agriculture should not include cooking.
Can I go next, Eriko?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the insightful session. I think I learned more in this session than I did in my ESG and sustainability class. Um, I'll try to phrase and articulate my question coherently, but please forgive me if I'm not able to. Um, So we see a lot of AI proliferation coming in, and this AI uses very vast computational data which consumes a lot of electricity, right? And not to forget, they also consume a lot of water for the cooling centers and all. So we are somehow trying to achieve net zero, but also we are seeing a lot of AI coming in, right? So how does it go hand in hand? Like, isn't it contradictory in a way?
Yeah, it's definitely contradictory because like data centers are demanding and consuming more and more electricity, and our rollout of renewables is slower than the rate at which demand is increasing. So you're totally right. Um, I think in terms of, I mean, that's a new source of demand that we have to account for. It's a source of demand that it's too new to know how much of like future energy demand it's going to account for as well. Like for example, OpenAI and ChatGPT was consuming a lot more energy. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head. Um, then now DeepSeek has come in as a disruptor. And DeepSeek, with the types of chips it uses and the way that its processing is designed, uses far less energy. So that is totally changing the way that we had thought of the way that AI and AI processing is going to demand energy in the future. So I think one part of it is being able to forecast how the energy demand for it in the future. And the second part of it is, and related to that is technological improvement, hopefully being able to come up with hardware that is more efficient. Um, the other part of like the AI and data center bit is that we can use AI to like improve a lot of kind of like what I've mentioned as like the demand response in relation to um, shifting the load of demand for electricity. We can use AI to kind of predict, okay, like human behavior better, and be able to decide when to dispatch a certain type of renewable source or electricity source. But that's all going to consume electricity. So a lot of times, what data centers are doing now is that they're going to have their own kind of, especially like, for example, Google and its data centers, they have direct purchasing power agreements. So these are direct agreements that the consumer has with a provider of, not a provider, but an asset that they are going to be able to consume the amount of electricity that this wind farm or solar farm can produce. But you're right, that is a totally new source of demand that we have to account for in the future. I don't know
Yeah,
if I answered your question,
you
but if
did.
you,
Thank you so much.
yeah. I received another question on how does the recent changes in US policies impact our global mission for climate change? Yeah, that's a tricky one. I guess because I didn't want to really think about this, I haven't really been keeping up on how it's already impacted the global mission for climate change. But what I remember is that when Trump came into power in 2016, and the US, for the first time, um, dropped out of the Paris Agreement, a lot of other actors had to step up. So in that case, it was like the EU. It also meant that I think there's a lot of, US politics is very divisive. There are a lot of people in government that do believe in climate change and that do want to promote net zero. And so for them, it now depends on state level governance. Like California is very ambitious. But now, how does that relate to the global mission for climate change? Well, the kind of like drop out of the US from the Paris Agreement combined with kind of like the paralysis of USAID, but no, that definitely affects a lot of programs in the developing world. I think we're going to have to find other sources of funding. I think they were driving a lot of ambitious projects in the developing world that I think we're still trying to figure out how to find other resources. In terms of achieving net zero, though, other actors have to step up, or I think we're very much off track on net zero.
I can chime in because good job, Eriko. My name is Kevin. I'm from the US and I'm a climate researcher as well. So I'm in Nepal this year, but as far as what's going to happen in the US right now, like we're still going to decarbonize because, and I work specifically in the building sector. The reality of what is happening in the United States is the cheapest forms of generating electricity are pretty much the low carbon ones. Like all the new generation is solar, wind, pretty much those two, some hydro, and then natural gas, which is a lot cheaper than the other dirtier generation sources that we have, like coal. Nuclear has been about the same, but the issue that we have on the generation side is like we just have these big leases on like we have huge capital intensive projects to build coal power plants that happened like 20 years ago and natural gas, but they just if we make this huge investment for a 30-year project, it's hard to retire that power plant ahead of time. So that's one thing I wanted to mention as like a warning for Nepal, because you don't have any coal or natural gas power plants right now. But if you do, that will be probably a 30-year commitment. And essentially you need to convince yourself, like, it's very difficult to retire those plants economically. And then so on the generation side, that's one warning I wanted to give you, because that's the situation we're in. But the grid is moving towards decarbonization from an economically. And then on the demand side, we had a lot of legislation passed through Congress that was really good for like building our transmission system out so we can accommodate more renewables on our grid and improving our buildings. And that can't go away with executive order. So like that's still going on right now. And so we still have a lot of money to improve our buildings through the government, and that will be harder to take away. But I think we'll see positive direction. We just aren't a leader, which sucks, but yeah, that's the situation. So I did want to mention maybe like two more things, just from my experience. Like I work on demand side management in buildings, so I'm a building researcher. And like one problem that may come up in Nepal is y'all have like 90% hydro, and then like the only dirty stuff comes in from India when the dry season. Our situation on our grid's a lot different because we have more renewables, but day by day, like the amount of renewables changes based on where you are, which creates this big math problem of like when you consume energy in buildings matters a lot for decarbonization. So if you do end up getting carbon intensive stuff on your grid, it might be more difficult to figure out how much carbon is coming from the electricity. But that's a big challenge that we have. Like the amount of carbon that's in the electricity is changing throughout the day. So a big part of my work is making our buildings smart enough to consume electricity at the right time. So that's another one of the challenges that we face, which we do use AI for. Yeah, those are the two, and then the last is a question for Eriko. Like, with the solar in Nepal, do you have any plan to use like pumped storage? Like, you have all these hydro dams. Do you ever think to get solar to pump the water up for long-term storage? So then maybe you don't need to import, or is that part of the plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually thinking about storage as you were talking, and you made some really great points. So thanks for your contribution. As far as I know, so we have like a huge share of some very large hydropower plants, like they're called Tamakoshi, I think 1, 2, and 3. They're like gigawatt scale. And there is no pumped storage that's created for them, as far as I understand. There are reservoirs, but I don't think so. The issue that we have is that in the dry season, the water level falls very low. And so you're suggesting that we use solar to pump up the water that exists in order to be able to operate the hydropower plant in the dry season, right? I haven't really seen that. I think we have a lot of like micro or like mini hydropower plants, which probably could have that type of solar that is connected to the hydropower plants, but these are like at very like small scale. So cumulatively, I don't know what their like impact would be. I think for the large hydropower plants, in most cases, like they're kind of built on the edge of like very difficult terrain. And so adding on more infrastructure can be a challenge. I'm not sure if it's something that like government engineers have already explored. I don't really know the status of it. And I think it's a good point that if we could store enough potential energy so that we are prepared for a dry season, then that would be like super helpful for us and we wouldn't have to import from India. I just don't think it's happened at scale, probably for very much like infrastructure related challenges. Yeah.
It'll probably be tricky, but it might work for some cases.
Yeah. Where do you work on demand side response?
Like, my
In
main
Nepal.
in Nepal, I'm not doing it in Nepal.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, okay.
I'm kind of just taking a year off from that stuff for this year when I'm in Nepal, but I'll go back and probably keep working on it back in the States after I'm finished here in May. I'm working at an agriculture college here in Lamjung just for a year. So one of my old students actually asked me to come to this. So that's how I figured, that's how I learned of it.
Wow. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, can I go?
Sure.
Can I ask in Nepali or is it okay in English?
हुन्छ नेपालीमा पनि हुन्छ
म अलि सजिलो गरी आफूलाई कम्फर्टेबल वेमा भन्छु सो जस्तै इन्डिभिजुअल लेभलमा गर्ने अथवा लाइक अर्गनाइजेसन लेभलमा हामीले एडभोकेट गरिरहेको हुन्छौँ क्लाइमेट एक्सनको लागि अथवा इन्भाइरोमेन्ट प्रोटेक्सनको लागि त्यो हेर्दाखेरि चाहिँ अब गभर्मेन्ट पर्सपेक्टिभबाट हेर्ने हो भने वी डोन्ट सी एनी काइन्ड अफ त्यस्तो भनौँ न लाइक एडभोकेट गरिरहेको देखिँदैन प्लान्सहरू हुन्छ जुन चाहिँ इम्प्लिमेन्ट भइरहेको देखिँदैन होइन चाहे त्यो युएसकै केसमा होस् वी डोन्ट सी ट्रम्प एडभोकेटिङ फर क्लाइमेट एक्सन्स अर इन्भाइरोमेन्ट हो होइन रादर इज लाइक इलन मस्कहरूसँग मिलेर लाइक काइन्ड अफ अब उनीहरू त टेक जायन्ट्सहरू छ अब टेकले गर्दाखेरि एक हिसाबले इन्भाइरोमेन्ट डिग्रेड नै भइरहेको छ सो त्यो केसमा अब पोलिटिकल लिडर्सहरूले त त्यो एडभोकेट गरिरहेको नि देखिँदैन इम्प्लिमेन्ट गरिरहेको नि यसो देखिएको छैन तर गर्नुपर्ने त उनीहरूले हो नि त खास इन्डिभिजुअल लेभलमा जस्तै अब ग्रेटा थनबर्गले आएर कराइरहेको हुन्छ उसले भनिरहेको हुन्छ उसले च्याप्पा समाज थुनिदिन्छ तर त्यो लास्टमा त त्यो इफिसियन्सी नै भएन जस्तो लाग्छ कि इफिसियन्ट चाहिँ जब हुन्थ्यो तब हुन्थ्यो जब चाहिँ लाइक पोलिटिकल्ली लिडर्सहरूले चाहिँ त्यसलाई इम्प्लिमेन्ट गरेर लाग्थ्यो नि त, तर त्यो देखिँदैन, त्यो ग्याप जस्तो देखिन्छ। सो मलाई चाहिँ कस्तो फिल हुन्छ भने काइन्ड अफ प्याराडक्स जस्तो कि हामी कराइरहेछौँ, एडभोकेट्सहरू बोलिरहेछ, तर जुन इम्प्लिमेन्ट हुने पार्ट छ उतापट्टि गभर्मेन्ट, उसले त केही त्यो वेमा गरिरहेको छैन नि त। सो हाउ क्यान वी फिल द्याट ग्याप, अनि कसरी इफिसियन्सी गेन गर्न सक्छौँ होला? वाट डु थिङ्क इन द्याट म्याटर?
Oh, I mean, that's a big question, I know, on how to all but I think your question is essentially the demand response. Demand response doesn't, like, at the individual scale, isn't very impactful. It would be more impactful on a systemic scale and a structurally, and the government is responsible for that, but the government is very poor at implementing incentives, policies for a more systemic response. I know tapeko prashna. So if we had the answer to that, I think we would solve a lot of implementation related issues. I think that's something that I also am like struggling with. I'm not sure how to achieve it. I think what the government should actually be focusing on are like the bad actors, and by that what I mean are like the big emitting companies or sectors. So like our industry man, let's say like cement sector, brick sector, when it comes to and these are like easy things because they're like concentrated, you can focus on them. That would be a great implementation strategy. Focus on like the larger emitters first and then go into more individual level, but I think the individual level is also important because individual behavior takes a long time to change. Like for example, transportation would be a great start for the government to like actually have a plan to switch to like more like better public transit. Let's say, if we just had a public transit system that had buses that had like a timetable, त्यत्तिकै बाटो कुनामा कुहिन राख्नुपर्ने भए त्यो पनि सजिलो हुन्थ्यो हैन? But I think the government in this case, like let's say Ministry of Forest and Environment, it has a very high turnover, which makes it very difficult for it to plan ahead. A lot of times goals are set without the intention of implementation, unfortunately. So that's kind of the reality that we are in, which is very sad. I think that when it comes to implementation, unless there is like an economic advantage, like in the case of Nepal and the number of EVs that exist already in Nepal, just because of the way that taxes are structured, that already creates an individual like consumer choice. It's just not very well regulated, which is creating now congestion, for example, in like urban areas like Kathmandu. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, so like feel free to redirect me.
No, you ठिक छ
ठिक छ
because like त्यो उ गर्नै सकिँदैन जस्तो लाग्छ कि मलाई चाहिँ, अब भनौँ न, किनकि मलाई नै आइएम ब्याकग्राउन्ड आई हेभ अ ब्याकग्राउन्ड अफ आइटी होइन, म चाहिँ आइटी स्टुडेन्ट हो, तर बच्चादेखि आई बिन इन्भल्भिङ इन लाइक स्काउटिङ अनि लाइक एडभोकेटिङ फर क्लाइमेट एक्सन्स दिस एन्ड द्याट अल, तर एट द एन्ड इट फिल्स लाइक आइ एम जस्ट स्टक वेयर आई एम जस्तो कि, किनकि जसले गर्नुपर्ने हो त्यसले गरिरहेछन्, एन्ड I just feel like that I'm just speaking but no one's listening kind of, होइन त्यो फिल हुन्छ। अनि कस्तो भने अब आइएम फ्रम बौद्ध, अनि मेरो घरबाट चाहिँ लाइक मैले बुढा नीलकण्ठको एरिया देख्थेँ कि देखिन्छ हाम्रोबाट, त्यो फरेस्ट लाइन कहाँ तल थियो अहिले, पहिला 10 वर्ष नट 10 वर्ष भने 5 वर्ष अगाडि फरेस्ट लाइन कति तल थियो, तर अहिले हेर्ने हो भने त्यो माथि 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 गएको देखिन्छ कि फरेस्ट लाइन। अनि आई जस्ट फिल लाइक कस्तो त्यो आफूलाई नै नराम्रो फिल भएर आउँछ क्या त्यो देख्दाखेरि। बट मैले के गर्न सक्छु भन्दाखेरि आई जस्ट क्यान डु एनिथिङ, जस्तो कि जस्ट एडभोकेटिङ or just educating my friends. That's not gonna bring the drastic change, and I just see my government failing in every steps of like protecting the nature that we have. I know it feels like paradox जस्तो कि like I'm shouting and there's no one listening जस्तो अनि जसले इफिसियन्ट वेमा गर्न सक्थ्यो त्यो छैन गरिरहेको छैन अनि विल द्याट काइन्ड अफ प्रोटेक्ट दिस नेचर भन्ने जस्तो क्या किनकि
Oh,
होइन सो
well, I think, sorry, once.
हजुर अनि त्यही त त्यो केसमा चाहिँ अब कसरी बचाउने जस्तो कि लाइक एउटा अर्गनाइजेसन एनजिओ आइएनजिओ अथवा कुनै त्यस्तै इन्भाइरोमेन्ट प्रोटेक्टिङ अर्गनाइजेसन अलिकति बोलेर मात्र त्यो हो इम्प्याक्ट छ इम्प्याक्ट पार्छ गर्दै नगर्नुभन्दा गरेको इट्स बेटर तर जुन हामीले लाइक एक्सपेक्ट गरिरहेको हुन्छ नि यस्तो भइदिएदेखि लाइक केही हिसाबमा बस्थ्यो होला भन्ने त्यो चाहिँ भइरहेको छैन अनि द्याट मेक्स मी रियली स्याड त्यो
Oh,
हुन्छ
thank you for sharing that, eh? I think the government also knows what they need to do. I think it's not that हाम्रो assessment सबै नभएको त हैन, like we have so many assessments, we have so many like technical reports. The government has commissioned a lot of these reports. I think the issue is that we are really poor at implementing, like you said. And I think the people who are in power, even though they know what needs to be done, lack incentives to implement real solutions, real regulations, because it doesn't benefit them and because there's no accountability for them. So I think like that type of change that you want to have comes over a long period of time. I think we need to have more young people in government like you who care about it on a personal level as well, about protecting forests, about air quality. I mean, I don't really have a good answer for you. Like, किनभने अब यो त एकदम सिस्टेमिक कुरा हो. अब म पनि अलिकति गभर्मेन्टसित काम गरिरहेको थिएँ. म पनि अलिकति डिसल्युजन भएर स्विच गरेँ होइन प्राइभेट सेक्टरमा. अब गभर्मेन्टमा पोलिसीमा काम गर्न मन थियो अनि गभर्मेन्टले नै कति लाइक असेसमेन्ट माग्छ, असेसमेन्ट मागेर हेरेपछि ल म अर्को कुरा गर्छु भन्छ. So it's like there's just no accountability for government officials, and you can't give advice to someone who's not looking for it. That's one thing. The other is it's hard to implement real like effective policies when there's no accountability for politicians.
Yeah, thank you. There you go.
Okay. I think on that sober note, we might be coming to an end. Your talk, Gopal?
Yeah, on behalf of Kuhiro Class, I would like to thank you for taking this session and enlightening us on decarbonization. Yeah, once again, thank you so much, Eriko, for taking the time for joining this session.
Thank you all as well for attending. Okay. Okay, bye. Have a good evening.
Good job.
Eriko,
Thank
yeah,
you.
just one thing. Yeah, I've just sent your connection in LinkedIn. So if you can, yeah, we can just connect and we can share our talks in later days too. Yeah.
Okay, I'll accept it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your all insights and valuable knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.